Located in Helensburgh, south of Sydney, lies a cemetery that many haven't heard of. Many drive along the M1 not knowing it lays just a few hundred metres up the hill. The bush has almost reclaimed it. Time has weathered the headstones, consumed the paths, and hidden many of the graves beneath the blanket of leaves and native scrub. Apart from the birds, rustling leaves, and distant hum of traffic, there's little to disturb the virtual silence. It's peaceful here, yet on this quiet hillside rest more than 2,000 people. They came from bustling city streets, country towns, even from the other side of the world. Every one of them arrived carrying the same hope: to recover. Instead, this secluded patch of bush became their final resting place. Today it's known as the Garrawarra Cemetery, or the Waterfall Consumptive Hospital Cemetery, one of Australia's most poignant and least known burial grounds, a place where nearly every grave tells the story of a disease that once terrified the world: tuberculosis. Long before antibiotics, it was known simply as consumption, or the White Plague, a slow, relentless illness that stole breath, strength, and all too often, life itself. During the early decades of the 20th century, it claimed thousands of Australians every year. There was no cure, only the hope that rest, fresh air, and time might succeed where medicine could not. To give patients that chance, a hospital was built here, surrounded by bushland and the cool mountain air of the Illawarra Escarpment. For many, it promised a second chance. For more than 2,000 others, the journey ended here. In 1909, a new hospital was established here at Waterfall on the edge of the Royal National Park. Far enough from Sydney to reduce the risk of infection, yet close enough to remain accessible by rail. The location was no accident. The cool mountain air and peaceful surroundings were thought to offer patients their best chance of recovery. For those admitted here, life quickly settled into a strict routine. Temperatures were taken, meals were served, and doctors carefully monitored every sign of improvement or decline. Without medicines to rely on, treatment centred on rest. Patients spent hours each day lying on verandas, breathing the cool air, wrapped in blankets during the winter or sheltered from the summer sun. The days could feel endlessly repetitive. Reading, writing letters, knitting, quiet conversation, or simply watching the bush beyond the hospital grounds. For many, friendships formed between people who understood one another's fears in a way no one else could. Families faced long journeys to visit, and many patients spent weeks, even months, separated from those they loved. Many never saw home again. For some patients, the treatment worked. They regained their strength and eventually returned home to rebuild their lives. For others, the disease had already taken too firm a hold. When hope faded, there was no long procession through city streets. The journey was a short one, from the hospital to the cemetery beyond the trees. One grave became 10, 10 became 100, eventually more than 2,000. Each headstone marked a life interrupted. Some belonged to children, others to young men and women whose futures had barely begun. They arrived believing they might recover. Yet here they rest, each with their own story. Among the thousands who came to Waterfall was a young Englishman whose future once seemed destined for the stage. His name was Reginald Anson. Looking at his portrait today, it's difficult to imagine that his life would end here. Born in England, Reginald grew up at a time when theatre was one of the world's great forms of entertainment. Grand playhouses drew packed audiences night after night, and for talented young performers, the stage offered excitement, travel, and the chance to build a career in the spotlight. Like so many others seeking opportunity, Reginald eventually made his way to Australia. Here he pursued his dream of becoming an actor, performing with travelling theatrical companies and appearing before audiences eager for an evening's escape. But behind the curtain, another story was unfolding. Tuberculosis rarely announced itself overnight. It crept into a person's life slowly. Eventually, everyday tasks became exhausting. For an actor, whose livelihood depended on energy, confidence, and presence, it was a devastating diagnosis. As his condition worsened, Reginald was admitted to the Waterfall Sanatorium, joining hundreds of others hoping that the fresh mountain air might succeed where medicine could not. The days that followed would have been painfully familiar to every patient here. Hours spent resting on open verandas, regular examinations, simple meals, long periods of waiting for a future that grew more uncertain with each passing week. For Reginald, that future never came. He died at Waterfall, far from the English home where his life had begun, and far from the theatre audiences he'd once hoped to entertain. Today, his headstone lays toppled beneath the trees. But Reginald's story reminds us that the cemetery isn't simply a collection of graves. It's a place where dreams, ambitions, and ordinary lives came to an abrupt end. Reginald's story wasn't unusual. The graves scattered throughout this bush belonged to people from every corner of society. Some were actors, others were tradesmen, mothers, returned servicemen, and young people whose adult lives had barely begun. Each arrived with their own hopes for the future. Few expected their journey to end here. Bill Christie was just one of them. Unlike Reginald's, Bill's ambitions weren't found on the stage. They were found in books. Even as tuberculosis confined him to bed for long periods, he refused to let the disease dictate his future. Instead, he studied accountancy with extraordinary determination. In 1932, despite the enormous challenges he faced, Bill achieved the highest marks in New South Wales in his professional exams. It was a remarkable achievement. His success earned him a position with one of Sydney's leading accounting firms, proof that perseverance could still triumph over adversity. But tuberculosis rarely surrendered so easily. Bill's health declined once again. In 1938, at just 26 years of age, he died. His ashes were interred here at Garrawarra at the grave of his young brother, John, who also rests here. Looking at their headstone today, it's hard not to wonder what life might have held for them had modern medicine arrived just a few years earlier. Another young man arrived at Waterfall under very different circumstances. Peter Joseph Victor Hanlon was born in Dublin, Ireland. After losing both of his parents, he emigrated to Australia as a teenager in 1914, hoping to begin a new life. Only weeks after his arrival, the First World War erupted. Like thousands of other young Australians, Peter volunteered to serve. He enlisted in the Royal Australian Navy and trained as a stoker, serving aboard HMAS Psyche. Life below deck was hot, physically demanding, and often unhealthy. Within little more than a year, Peter's health had deteriorated so badly he was discharged from active service. On the 4th of May 1916, he was admitted to the Waterfall Sanatorium. 4 months later, he was dead. He was just 19 years old. Their stories were different. An actor, an aspiring accountant, a teenage sailor. Yet all three arrived here carrying exactly the same hope. That somehow they might recover. The advent of antibiotic treatments, along with thoracic surgery and a national campaign to prevent tuberculosis, led to the closure of the sanatorium in 1958. It ran as the Garrawarra Hospital until 1991, before closing permanently. The wards have long since fallen silent and abandoned. The conversations and footsteps that once echoed through the buildings disappeared decades ago. A kilometre south of the old hospital, the cemetery remains. More than 2,000 people are buried here. Some arrived from nearby Sydney, others travelled from country New South Wales. A few crossed oceans before fate brought them to this quiet hillside. Most were simply ordinary people whose lives were interrupted by an extraordinary disease. An actor whose curtain fell too soon. A young man whose determination outlived his illness. A teenage sailor who never lived to see the peace he volunteered to defend. There are hundreds of other stories here. Many have been lost to time. Others survive only as names etched into weathered stone or plaques. Yet every grave marks a life that mattered to someone. Places like Garrawarra remind us just how devastating tuberculosis once was. Not through statistics, but through people. As the bush continues to reclaim this hillside, the stories beneath it become quieter with every passing year. Maybe that's why places like this matter. Because as long as someone pauses, reads a name, or tells a story, they're never truly forgotten.